Hey, we're going to start here. And good afternoon, actually good morning.
No, so the definition of faith.
What year did that happen?
That happened, this is 1938. And we'll get started here in 1 second. My name is Evan Weiner, been here before, hope all is well. And it's the early days of radio, so it's programs that some people remember from the old days, like Superman. How many of you listened to Superman back in the old days?
Oh, yeah.
Bud Collyer. Early days of radio. Radio became major importance 1938 in terms of how widely heard things were and how people took everything they heard on radio as the real thing. Orson Welles, 1938, War of the Worlds. And that was done on October 30th, 1938. Gate night, devil night, egg night. When I was going to high school in Rockland County back in the late 60s, people called it egg night because people threw eggs at houses and things like that. Devil's night, night before Halloween. And so the night before Halloween, Orson Welles has a radio show on called War of the Worlds. H.G. Wells' book from 1898. And not too many people heard this, but there was a hysteria that took place because of radio fake scares nation. The 1897-1898 book, War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells. Orson Welles decides, this is a pretty good story. Let me dramatize it on radio, and we'll put it on the night before Halloween. The problem was, for people, that show that Wells was doing on CBS went up against the Edgar Bergen, Charlie McCarthy show, or at least the first half hour. And most people were listening to Edgar Bergen, and they flipped on to this show afterwards, and they heard that the Martians were invading New Jersey. New Jersey. Why New Jersey? Well, New Jersey. It was Wells' Mercury Theater on the air, and that had been on CBS for about 17 weeks. It was a real low-budget program. Didn't have a sponsor. They threw it on, but they had a small but loyal following. And what he was doing adaptations of literary classics. I conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening. Wasn't exactly a new idea. BBC in 1926 in England did the same thing. So I'm not sure if Wells knew about it or not, but he doesn't. And here is the show. And basically the premise of the show is simple. Martians land in New Jersey, outside of Princeton. And they're invading. And they're going to invade all over the United States. It's funny, coming up here, I just listened to WINS, and there was a story about UFOs being seen lately by the Air Force, and there's something going on out there, but whether that's happening or not is beside the story. But here's Orson Welles, here's the show, and they're doing it. Grover's Mill, New Jersey, being invaded. Wells in his Mercury Theater on the air had performed the Wells War of the Worlds book. And it becomes fake news because Wells is doing this program that starts out basically as a music show. There were a lot of music shows back in those days, a big band show. And you have an announcer cutting in saying, well, New Jersey is being invaded. We'll have more in a few minutes. And then they go back to the music. And then an announcer would come in. The Martians have been spotted in Grover Mills, New Jersey. Some listeners mistook the bulletins for the real thing, partly because they didn't hear at the beginning of the show, we're presenting a drama, and this is a dramatization. So they think it's the real thing. And about 15 years ago, I did this talk up in Nyack, New York, and there was a guy who was from Princeton, New Jersey. And he says, you know, we listened to that show. I said, yeah? He says, yeah. He said, let me tell you something. He said, my father got all the kids around, 3 kids, and he said, go into the garage, get a rake, get a shovel, get a hoe, because when those Martians come, that's the only thing we have to defend us, because they were 12 miles from where this was taking place. Other listeners back then called up the police, called up newspapers' offices, called up radio stations, and it convinced many journalists that the show had caused a nationwide hysteria. Like this guy in New Jersey whose father said, get a rake, get a shovel, get whatever you are, we got to defend our house. And there's Wells talking about the show afterwards. After all, it was only a show. But people called into CBS. The switchboard operators couldn't keep up with the calls. Some of the actors came off the show and they went into the switchboard room to convince people, hey, this is just a show. That's all it is a show. But meanwhile, police departments and fire departments across the country have to respond to what is going on. And Wells realizes, also radio executives realize that people take radio seriously, and it's important. In 1938, it certainly was important. The panic. 2/3 of the 1-hour broadcast was presented as a series of simulated news bulletins. Sounded real to some. According to Radiolab, about 12 million people were listening to that show at the time. And about 1 in every 12 thought it was true. Some percentage, about 1 million, ran out of their homes. That constitutes a major freakout, according to Radiolab. The Federal Communications Commission got involved with this afterwards. Why did it cause a panic among some people? And they did a review of the show, and they said, wait, it didn't break any laws. But the networks agreed in the future, that would be NBC Red, NBC Blue, CBS, Mutual, who I work for until its demise. Networks did agree to be more cautious in their programming in the future. Oh, by the way, this broadcast, it led Orson Welles to get a contract with a Hollywood studio. And within a couple of years, he had Citizen Kane. Oh, and this is who they were fighting. Marvin the Martian. Martians. This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character to assure you that War of the Worlds has no further significance than as a holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of the bush and saying, boo, because it was on Halloween Eve. It was just a show. But if you ever go down to Grover's Mill, New Jersey, there's a little statue about, here's Wells and here's the Martians landing, and here are the people huddling up in their houses because they're afraid. So you can see that marker. And also, if you go down to Grover's Mill on October 30th of any given year, they have a War of the Worlds parade, a pre-Halloween costume festivities. At the end, it was just a radio show. But it showed how really powerful radio was in 1938 to some people who took the program seriously. And like I said, you could go down to Grover's Mill and you could party with people remembering a pre-Halloween non-event, because it never happened. I don't know how many of you were little and could say that you sat and watched radio. Anybody sat and watched radio back in the day?
I was 10.
You were 10. Did you sit in front of a radio?
I don't remember doing that. We watched a lot of radio. Though.
So you watched a lot of radio. You sat like that girl did.
Listened to a lot of radio.
But you have to watch it. And this is what I mean by watching radio.
Yeah.
We did, one of the reasons I'm interested in old-time radio is back in 1978, when I was 22 years old. I was at a radio station, WGRC, Nanuet, New York, which doesn't exist anymore. And every Sunday we had something called the Theater of the Imagination, radio. And it was at noon, and we had one constant show, the Jack Benny Show at noon. And the rest would be Burns and Allen, or the Inner Sanctum, or the Shadow. It evolved. And it caught my attention because radio, the theater of the imagination. You have to concentrate on radio. You don't have to concentrate on TV. You have to sit and listen to a show on radio. But if you miss something on TV, well, it's visual. and it's the visual that's impacting you. Radio, you're listening to it. And I've had a lot of people who said they sat just like that listening to the radio. In fact, I had one woman tell me that she and her sister, they were about 8, 9 years old, used to listen to Inner Sanctum. I don't know how many of you listen to Inner Sanctum?
Yeah.
Yeah, Inner Sanctum, they instructed you for the best listening experience to shut off the lights. And she and her sister would listen to Inner Sanctum, and they would be scared. They'd hold each other listening to the show. And she said those were some of the best days of her childhood, listening or watching radio like that. Radio starts in this place, Newfoundland. This is Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland. I speak on cruise ships, so when you actually, I haven't spoken on a cruise ship because of COVID for the last 3 years. But when you go into the port, this is one of the first things you see, Signal Hill. And this building here is where Marconi was. And Marconi takes the signal in 1901 from England, and voila, radio is born. The first transatlantic wireless transmission from Cornwall, the United Kingdom, to St. John's, Newfoundland takes place on December 12, 1901. The reason that was picked, there's nothing in between. All it is ocean. So that's it. Nothing to block the signal. Marconi placed his receiver at Signal Hill, the closest point to Europe and North America, 2,100 miles away. Marconi picks up the signal. I have a Grundig radio that I don't listen to anymore because it has tubes. You remember tubes that you put in TV and radio? And I can't figure out if a tube blows in there, where am I going to replace it? So basically it's just a showpiece right now. But it had shortwave radio. So I used to have a shortwave radio where I could listen to Radio Moscow if I wanted to way back when. That's 1951 Grundig radio. The sinking of the Titanic more than likely created United States radio. You're going to say, how was that? Sinking of the Titanic. Well, the sinking of the Titanic was back on April 14th, 1912. David Sarnoff was in the right place at the right time. He managed the Marconi wireless station at the Wanamaker's department store. Remember John Wanamaker's, the department store? Kids don't. They have no idea John Wanamaker's. Anyway, that evening, the ocean liner of the Titanic struck an iceberg not far from Halifax and sank. And there is David Sarnoff. And he gets this idea. He's working in the wireless. Wow, if somehow I could get this and send these signals out to people, we could start something here. Almost immediately, the ship sent transmitting distress signals. The airwaves were flooded with the news of the disaster as operators tracked the rescue effort. Sarnoff went to his station in Manhattan at the Wanamaker store, and he had a crew, which he was the boss of telegraphers over the next 3 days, and they published the survivors of the Titanic tragedy. And he's thinking, can I somehow get a piece of that spectrum? And if I could get a piece of that spectrum, I could do something with it. After 3 days, he goes out to Coney Island, and he contacts the steamer ship, the Carpentier, which had picked up survivors of the Titanic, returning to New York. He gets the names of the people who survived, and he forwards the news to their families. And there is Sarnoff at Wanamaker's back then. In 1915 or 1916, because of what happened during the Titanic, he writes something called the Radio Music Box Memo. And he proposes the development of commercially marketed radio receivers in the home. 1919, the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, gets the Marconi station from the U.S. Navy. On November 2nd, 1920, the first commercial radio station in the United States, KDKA in Pittsburgh. Why KDKA Pittsburgh? George Westinghouse, Westinghouse Laboratories. They're working on developing not only this radio thing, but something that could bring an image into your home eventually, which would be called television eventually. KDKA was the first commercially licensed radio station. Its first program, The Harding-Cox presidential election returns, 1920. And I guarantee you the announcer, Leo Rosenberg, did not have a big board that he touched and said, here's where votes are coming from, there's where votes are coming from. He just probably read whatever the wire services put out. This changes radio, though. It's a big fight. And it takes place in Jersey City, New Jersey. And it's Jack Dempsey, who's sort of a Muhammad Ali character in his day because he never served in World War I. People accused him of being a draft dodger, but he said, I'm the sole support for my extended family, so he did not go into World War I. He's fighting a guy from France by the name of Carpentier. David Sarnoff has it all figured out, though. For RCA to sell radios, has to have programming. So he arranges for the broadcast of the Dempsey-George Carpentier fight. It takes place on July 2nd, 1921, a place called Boyle's 30 Acres in Jersey City. And they put up this temporary stadium that's set 91,000 people. And RCA is there, and they're putting the program on the station in Pittsburgh, KDKA. Why that? It's the only station out there. The other thing is, KDKA can get west of the Mississippi, can get to the Atlantic coast, get to the Gulf Coast, and get into Canada. It has a very large range. It still has that large range today. So this is the first national radio broadcast east of the Rockies. And there is Dempsey. He wins a 4-round knockout over Carpentier, 12 rounds, but that's not the story. That's not the story at all. The big news was the radio broadcast of the fight on July 2nd, 1921. It wasn't the first big boxing match on radio. This guy looks real tough, right? Johnny Ray. This guy was in the first fight that was done on radio on KDKA a couple weeks earlier, April 11th, 1921. A 10-round, no decision fight between Johnny Ray and Johnny Dundee at Pittsburgh's Motor Square Garden. But, you know, it's just a local fight, no big deal. The other fight was a big deal. Harold Arlen, whose son played Major League Baseball with the San Diego Padres in 1969. Harold Arlen was the first baseball announcer. On August 5th, 1921, first broadcast of the baseball game on KDKA, Philadelphia Phillies, Pittsburgh Pirates. And you know what? Through sports, radio started selling. Radio were being sold in the United States, and they weren't very cheap. Warren G. Harding gets radio installed in the White House. I guess he's watching radio, isn't he? Harding. He's supposed to turn, right? Harding. 1921, Harding makes history. He sends a radio message over RCA's Radio Central Relay Network from the White House across the world. People in Riverhead, out the island, hear it. And also in Australia, in Japan, and 15 other countries. He installs a radio in the White House on February 8, 1922. Almost 2 years later, Calvin Coolidge, who took over after Harding died, was the first president to broadcast from the White House. His address, Washington's birthday, and celebrating Washington's birthday, and he's heard on 42 stations. Another big seller, the World Series. You bought your radio to hear the World Series, mainly because you wanted to hear about this guy, the Babe. The Babe. The Babe. I mean, if other teams were involved, and if it wasn't Babe Ruth, I'm not sure how many people would have bought radios. But they bought radios because of the Babe. By 1924, Sarnoff's idea, the radio, or the radiola, had sold $83 million worth of units. Multiply that by about 20 now, and you get, what would you get? About $1.6 billion of radios in today's money. The first radio program that took place from a presidential convention, June 10th, 1924, the Republican Convention in Cleveland, Ohio. Radio's big news story during the two-day convention was the nomination of Calvin Coolidge, the incumbent, as the presidential candidate for the Republicans. Hey, how'd you like to own that car? But how would you like to listen to radio in that car in December? Because the speaker is outside. It's not in the car. It's outside the car. So would you like to listen to radio, say, during a snowstorm in January, riding that car? probably you couldn't do it. The night before the 1924 election, Coolidge, guy who allegedly didn't say much, there was one person who told me a story about Coolidge, saying he's sitting next to a woman, and the woman says to him, "I'll bet you $5 that I can make you say more than 5 words," and he turns and looks at her and says, "You lose." Silent cat. He won the election. He gives a speech right before the 1924 election. In March, Americans listened to the first time to a president take the oath of office on radio. You might remember NBC, boom, 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 3 little tones. And there was a whole song that these 3 little tones mean I love you and all that other stuff. Sarnoff gets his network started. NBC Red, NBC Blue. NBC Red, the flagship network, had the established shows, the advertisers. They had the programs you probably listened to. Radio plays, mysteries, adventures, detective series, soap operas, quiz shows, variety hours, talent shows, and also big band shows. NBC Blue, that would be more of me because I was in journalism, had sustaining shows, news and public affairs programming, which they didn't really sell advertising to. And there's NBC Blue. That would be the network I would have worked on in those days. Headlines, remote reporting, sidewalk interviews, panel discussions, weather reports, farm reports. You can hear that on NBC Blue. Meanwhile, this guy, Bill Paley, buys into a small radio station in Philadelphia in 1927, WCAU Radio, and with that starts the CBS network. He actually was the Columbia phonograph broadcast system, and he invests with his relatives. He would become the president of Columbia on September 26, 1928. He moves up to New York City, and they have 49 affiliates, and there is competition between NBC and CBS. Some of the radio stars of those days, that's Ed Wynn, and this is a Radio Star magazine, and among the people that they're showcasing, I guess, Rudy Valley and the Connecticut Yankees, Kate Smith, Mert and Marcy, who I don't know who they were, Paul Whiteman, who was a jazz player, Seth Parker, and Burns and Allen. Remember Burns and Allen? Say goodnight, Gracie. Goodnight, Gracie. The Goldbergs. Goldbergs went from radio to TV. Molly Goldberg at one time in her life was the second most admired woman in America behind Eleanor Roosevelt. Jack Benny, Rochester, Mary Benny, Tuscanini, you can hear the Metropolitan Opera if you wanted on radio. George Gershwin would pop up on shows like the Rudy Valley Fleischman Hour. Amos and Andy, a show about 2 black guys played by 2 white actors that ended up on TV in the 1950s. Burns and Allen, Fred Allen, who had a face made for radio. Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was a radio regular in the 1920s, also in the movies. Kate Smith had a very popular radio show in the 30s and 40s. In fact, on Kate Smith's show, Abbott and Costello did their national debut of Who's On First. The aforementioned Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Charlie McCarthy, of course, is Candice Bergen's brother, right? Guiding Light, soap operas. There were soap operas also on. Your Hit Parade, LSMFT, Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. The Lucky Strike, Your Hit Parade. Anybody listen to Your Hit Parade back in the day? Yeah. In the Grand Ole Opry, where I was in 2002, that's a picture of the new place. The old place is down in downtown Nashville, the Cathedral, Ryman Auditorium. That show has been on forever, literally forever, and it's still on. Grand Ole Opry is a weekly American country music stage concert in Nashville. It started in 1925 by George D. Hay as a 1-hour radio barn dance on WSM. It goes on NBC Network nationally in 1939. This is New Rochelle. This is a sign from Glen Island, where I'm going this afternoon with my granddaughters, because it's a nice little place to walk and they have a playground there. They're the big band era at the Glen Island Casino. And the casino is kind of still there. It's not really the same casino, but it's kind of still there. Anyway, big band shows were really popular. Every city had their own big band show. In fact, in Cincinnati, WLW, there was a big band show every Saturday night, and the featured singer was a local singer named Doris Day. Ever hear of Doris Day? And she goes out to Hollywood, and she's replaced by a woman by the name of Barbara Cameron, who I know her son, David Cameron, who's a musician on cruise ships. And he told me his mother wrote the Looney Tunes Roadrunner song. She took Doris Day's place. But the big bands used to play in New Rochelle, and the networks used to go up to New Rochelle, and they would broadcast live. People would be dancing, and these were the kind of shows both done nationally and locally. It's Gertrude Berg, the Goldbergs, born Tilly Elderstein in 1898. She performs at her father's resort in the Catskills in the Borscht Belt in 1912. She performs skits for kids. She meets an older gentleman from England by the name of Louis Berg, who woos her. And when she turns 18, in 1916, they get married. She moves to New Orleans for his career. He was an engineer on a sugar plantation until it burnt down. Then she comes back to New York, changes her name to Gertrude Berg, and she begins writing radio scripts about a fictional family called the Goldbergs, a combination of her mother's maiden name and her husband's last name. There she is. And she starts a show in 1929. And she's not supposed to be on the show. Somebody else is supposed to be on the show, playing Molly. She's sick one week, not on the show. And they get a ton of fan letters saying, "Where's Molly?" She stays. Molly Goldberg, 1936, becomes a very rich woman. She signs a 5-year, $1 million contract with Procter & Gamble. End of the decade, she's making $7,500 a week on this radio show, which she's writing, producing, and starring. During the height of her program only, Eleanor Roosevelt was more respected than Gertrude Berg. She wrote and performed an original sketch on TV, W2XPS in New York, the RCA station Channel 1, and she considered a live version of the Goldbergs, and she wanted TV to do it. Goldbergs left radio in 1946. She would be on TV in 1949 after being on Broadway, and she would win the first Emmy Award as the Best Actress on television. But the TV kills radio stars. She also had a cookbook, wrote an advice column called Mama's Talks, a movie by Paramount called Molly, and she's in the editing room on it. But she was blackballed during the McCarthy era because she supported her TV co-star, Philip Loeb, who was accused of being a communist. Floyd Gibbons was one of the first news people in radio. Floyd Gibbons started his first broadcast on NBC's Red Network, February 24th, 1930. He was one of the best-known newspaper columnists and correspondents in the early 20th century. Lowell Thomas. You know anything about Lowell Thomas? You know anything about Lawrence of Arabia?
Just the name.
Okay, do you know anything about Lawrence of Arabia? Because he created Lawrence of Arabia.
Well, that was a great movie.
September 30th, 29th, 1930, he hosts his first CBS show. He was a radio commentator, but before that, he was a travel adventure writer. And he wrote about Lawrence of Arabia. Without Lowell Thomas, there probably is no Lawrence of Arabia. This guy was not known in the New York area, but around the country he was certainly known. His name is Don Mcneal, and he had a long-running variety show on first the NBC Blue Network, and then when ABC bought out NBC because there were some regulatory issues. He was out of Chicago. He starts the program on June 23rd, 1933. It runs through December 27th, 1968. 35 years, 35 and a half years. The longest MC of a network entertainment program. He beat out Bob Barker, Price is Right, beat out Johnny Carson. Oh, he was one of the first guys ever to use, say, radio or comedianship to run for president. He ran for president in 1948 on the Laugh Party ticket. By the way, Alex Trebek holds the record, longest game show host, 37 years. Here's a quick question. How many Jeopardy watchers are there in here? People watch Jeopardy. You do? You do? Who do you think told Merv Griffin to hire Alex Trebek as the host of Jeopardy? Any idea? Lucille Ball recommended him. Lucy knew talent. She knew talent. The comedian Fred Allen talked about Mcneal. He said he's a big, friendly fellow whose good nature pours through the microphone and listeners react in the same way anyone reacts to meeting him in person. He and other early settlers of radio established an intimacy that kept their audiences permanently loyal. The guy or the woman on the other end, she's your friend. She's your friend, he's your friend. That's how radio operates. Franklin Roosevelt did fireside chats starting in 1933 to go around the media. He just decided, I'm going to take this airtime. After all, the public owns the airwaves. And I'm going to tell you about what I'm doing. Who's on First started on the Kate Smith Show nationally and was obviously a big hit. It's 1938. Abbott and Costello are on the Kate Smith Show. Dress rehearsal. They're still doing Who's on First, and the producer of the show said, that's not going to make it do something else. And they said, you know, what do you want us to do? And then they're coming up to airtime, and they said, this is what we got. And the rest is history. They had one routine left. They almost didn't use it. Time was short. They said, use it. We just got to fill time. Who's on first? And with our morrow, this is London. He brought the war in Europe into homes of America. His rooftop reports of the Blitz helped define broadcast journalism. He started in 1939, and he gave vivid reports of the developments of far-off countries during the Blitz, and he brought the violence and emotion to war on American airwaves. You might remember him from What's My Line, John Charles Daly. John Charles Daly was the guy who told America first about the Pearl Harbor attack, December 7th, 1941. He reported the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air. President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all military and naval activities on the principal island of Oahu. The funny thing about that is that sounded a lot like Orson Welles' show, because it was cut in the middle of an opera, and they kept cutting in and out, in and out, in and out. Superman on radio. How many of you listened to The Adventures of Superman with Bud Collyer? Do you know why Superman has a problem with kryptonite? You know why? You're going to find out in a minute. Superman began as one of several anthology features in the national periodical publications, Comic Book Action Comic #1 in June 1938. National launched the Superman comic book in 1939. Starts on WOR Radio, which has celebrated its 100th birthday on February 12, 1940. It's on Mutual between 1942 and 1949. Superman has superpowers on Earth because of our sun. The Krypton sun was red. Kryptonite blocks the superpowers, and its radiation is poisonous to Kryptonians and can kill them. Well, the writers needed a storyline. That's the storyline because, well, there's Bud Collyer. Bud Collyer was the voice of Superman and of Clark Kent. Bud Collyer wants a vacation. He needs a vacation. He's working hard. He's on 7, 8 different shows. He's not credited on the show. So the writers on the show invent kryptonite in 1943 to make Superman sick. This allowed the voice of Superman to be absent without ruining the regular broadcast schedule, because all you needed was an actor to come on and go, oh, oh, oh. Comes back, he's healthy again. In the age of no reruns, it was one of America's most popular shows, radio's most popular shows. You have to keep it going without interruption, and the sick Superman allowed his voice to disappear, get some bed rest. The comic strip caught up with the radio show in 1949, Superman 61. First time Kryptonite appears in the comic strip. The stars of radio: Al Jolson, Jack Benny, Eddie Cantor, Bing Crosby, Abbott and Costello, Fred Allen, Victor Borger, Jimmy Durante, Phil Harris, Bob Hope, Amos and Andy, Burns and Allen, Fibber McGee and Molly, the Goldbergs, the great Gildersleeves. You Bet Your Life starts on radio, goes over the TV. The comic book characters: Blondie, Dick Tracy, Gasoline Alley, the Gumps, Lil Abner, Lil Off and Annie, Popeye. They're all on radio. Secret decoders. Anybody ever have a secret decoder ring? Did you find out what the secret message was?
No.
You never did? Lil Orphan Annie decoder number 1 was a fully functional, hand-operated cipher disc shaped as a wearable badge, released in 1936 as a children's toy. It's part of a successful promotion campaign for Ovaltine. Ovaltine also sponsored Captain Midnight and other shows. Basically, you listen to the clues. And eventually, it was like playing Hangman. Eventually, you would get it. And you know what the message was? Drink Ovaltine. This woman came in with the actual thing at a place once to show me. I said, why are you carrying that around? It's worth like $600. This guy invented FM radio. This is the Yonkers Library, where I'm speaking in August. And they have a little Hall of Fame with Ella Fitzgerald in there, and Sid Caesar, Joe Lapchick, and a few other famous people from Yonkers. He invented FM radio, Edward Armstrong. Seeking to kill FM before it could threaten his profits, David Sarnoff's company, RCA, successfully lobbied the FCC to have the FM spectrum removed from Armstrong's frequencies, 40 to 60 megahertz, to 88 to 108, which is what FM is today. The radio, here is the radio. That not only put Armstrong out of business, put some radio makers, people who made radios, out of business. The move comes on June 27, 1945. Armstrong's Yankee network is obsolete, along with all the FM radio sets that had been produced. Armstrong was consumed by his work, and ultimately it destroyed him. Patent litigations and battles with government regulators operating in collusion with Sarnoff and RCA to derail FM sapped his energy. He committed suicide, jumping out of a building in Manhattan. Before he did, he was in New Jersey. He hit his wife, got in his car, got to a hotel, went to the top of the hotel, and plunged to his death. His inventions remain the core of radio technology today. TV comes about. TV basically kills off radio. Television begins to make inroads in 1946. CBS and NBC have TV stations. Dumont starts a TV network. Radio is on the verge of being pushed aside. So, did television kill the radio star that you see here, Lucille Ball? Did television kill the radio star? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. My Favorite Husband, first broadcast, one-time special on CBS, July 5th, 1948. CBS's new series, Our Miss Brooks, is delayed, so they throw on this thing starring Lucille Ball called My Favorite Husband. Lucy and Lee Bowman play the characters of Liz and George Cugat. Positive response to the show convinces CBS, let's launch it as a series. Bowman's not available. Lucy and Richard Denning are the leads. The show changes the last name to Cooper from Cugat. Cugat, by the way, Xavier Cugat was the guy who found Desi Arnaz and propelled her to stardom, so they used the name there. My Favorite Husband, and she was a redhead. Featured Lucy, Richard Denning. The show was written by Jess Oppenheimer, Madeline Pugh, Bob Carroll Jr. Everybody there's integral to Lucy's success. They all moved to TV in 1951. That radio show becomes I Love My Favorite Husband ends in 1951 on radio. Arthur Gottfried is probably the last network radio star. His show begins in 1945, ends in 1972. It's on CBS, Monday through Friday, featured monologues, interviews, music, and vocalists, including Julius LaRosa, who I worked with at WNEW Radio way back when. Nicest guy in the world. Nicest guy in the world, Julius once said. He didn't fire me, I quit, and kind of was fumbled as we left. Julius was the only guy who visited Arthur Gottfried on his deathbed from entertainment. Talk and information is now leaking into radio. That's Gene Rayburn, Monitor. Monitor makes its NBC radio debut on June 12, 1955. It's a traditional radio with its half-hour and hour comedies, drama, variety shows. They're in desperate shape. Television had stolen most of radio's audience. Pat Weaver, who came up with the Tonight Show, the Today Show, and other shows for NBC, decided, let's do this on radio. It's a format so audacious and grandiose that nothing had ever been heard like it before. Talk radio. The era is over. There's Jack Benny and Bugs Bunny, rather Mel Blanc. End of an era. After 23 years, Jack Benny says goodbye. Very last episode, there's Jack Benny on the radio show with Mel Blanc as an interrupting sound effects man. The golden age is dead. Some shows continued. 1960, the last 4 daytime radio dramas on CBS. Young Dr. Malone, Right to Happiness, Second Mrs. Burton and Ma Perkins are all canceled. Alan Freed starts rock and roll in Cleveland in 1951 with his show, The Moondog Show, WJW in Cleveland. Radio's reign's over. Radio had to change to survive. Music, top 40, American standards, eventually FM would have formats and listeners, and news and talk radio formats were the norm on the AM band. Transistor radio brought in rock and roll. How many teenagers here had a transistor radio back in the day? Didn't have a transistor, huh? Transistors. Teenagers in the 50s loved the transistors. Why? You can listen to rock and roll without their parents bothering them. Music and information suddenly became more portable. No matter how isolated you were, you could hear the news of the world. Teenagers could listen to music anywhere, and that included being away from their parents. Teenagers wanted their own music. Rock and roll, teenagers must. Billboard magazine, November 10th, 1956. There's money to be made here. Rock and roll is no longer a novelty. Its honeymoon period with teenagers is over, and the reappraisal of its present appeal and future potential is taking place on the station management level. 79 of 179 managers participating in Billboard survey admitted they had to continually increase programming of rock and roll due to public opinion. Long live rock. It's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The typical management attitude today is that a judicious amount of rock and roll time for peak teenage hours in the 1950s is obligatory. While there have been many complaints and alienation within other listening segments of the population because of the excessive exposure of rock and roll, most analysts agree the current music is here to stay. AM radios were only available in the 1956 Chevrolet. Car radios started to have an FM band, included with the AM band in the late 1950s and 1960s. Rock and roll would find a place on the FM band. Suspense is the last of the old-time radio shows. September 30th, 1962, it ends. And that's it, it's gone. Yours truly, Johnny Dollar, and Suspense, radio's outstanding theater of thrills, says goodbye. Thanks for the memories. AM stations have gone off the air. One that you can actually hear around here, WFAS, 1230 on the dial in White Plains, gone. The AM band barely clings to life, and there are suggestions that it should just disappear. Radio stations used to be considered real estate, worth money. Not anymore. Most radio stations have little value. Yet, radio can be really reliable in a disaster. Why? Battery powered, don't need electricity, and people can give you information. That's me back in 1979 interviewing presidential candidate Jack Kemp, Sparkill, New York, as he's kicking off his campaign for the 1980 Republican nomination. He would eventually drop out. So you have news, and TV did kill the radio star. I was 15 at the time, and I was doing my first show called Tiger Talk at WRKL Radio with Doris Ham and Eugene Delisio. She went into fashion, and he went into radio as well. TV killed all the radio stars, and I ended up on TV as well. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours. Anybody? Talk about old radio.
Good performance.
What'd you listen to?
I went to, saw Babe Ruth play in 1937 in Yankee Stadium.
Oh, yeah? Yeah?
It was fun.
Yeah? Babe was a big star.
Yeah.
Big star. Huge star. Does anybody else have any questions or comments about listening to radio back then?
I think that's a very interesting presentation. I'm glad I saw it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good, very good.
Well, it's my life. I lived it.
Yeah, good.
I lived it.